out there. This is Nerdy by Nature. I'm your host, Agent Smith, aka Tyler.
And I'm your other host, Charlie, aka Captain Rogers.
And on this edition, as we promised in our last episode, we're going to be breaking down and reviewing Identity Crisis, authored by Brad Meltzer and beautifully drawn by Rads Morales and inked by Michael Baer. And if you haven't read this particular miniseries yet, we highly recommend it. With that being said, spoiler alert, we're going to be talking heavy spoilers, breakdowns, rundowns, synopsis, plot, the whole 9 yards for Identity Crisis. So we just ask that you go back and listen to some other episodes. We don't want to spoil anything for you. For those of you that have already read Identity Crisis, let's dive right into it. So, Charlie, I personally thoroughly enjoyed reading this one. How about you?
Oh yeah, I really enjoyed it. It was different than a lot of the comics that you normally read. It felt a lot more grounded and realistic comparatively. There wasn't a lot of big action set pieces to it. It was just a lot more of a, the heroes coming together, figuring out what's going on, and a lot more detective work versus action.
That's a great point, because to me it really did feel like a raw take on each one of these characters. And if you remember in the other episode, we said that this was a seismic shake to the DC universe.
Definitely.
And in this particular series, it's nothing short of that. I mean, you've got so much that goes on, so many significant moments. It's only a 7-chapter series, but each one has its own level of significance and moving pieces. Not only moving as far as operational standpoint, but also moves you on the inside. There's some moments where you were either taken back, or some moments that made you laugh a little bit, that comedic relief. Mm-hmm. This just has a little bit of everything, but it's not overdone.
Right, yeah, I mean, there was definitely edge of your seat moments, intense moments for sure. It was never boring to me. I never felt like I was dragging on reading about it or anything like that. It starts out with 2 characters on a stakeout, one being the elongated man and the other being Firehawk. They're watching for some kind of sale or deal, and they're just talking about each other's lives, and the main character being the elongated man, Ralph Dibny, is sitting there discussing with her his life and what he's been through. Talks a lot about his wife. You can really tell reading it that something's about to happen, and if you know anything about the story, something definitely happens, and it's not good.
No, it's not, and they hint to it, like you said, throughout some of those first panels. You see there in yellow, if I'm not mistaken, where it has kind of that countdown of like 11 minutes from now, 30 minutes from now. So you're listening to Ralph Dibny talk to Firehawk, but you're also listening to him consciously tell you, almost sort of like looking back, starts the making of what seems like a flashback, more or less, to leading up to the events that transpire, and that is, of course, the murder of his wife, Sue Dibny.
Right.
A tragic one, but also, with tragedy sometimes there comes a little bit of beauty in the sense of an artistic standpoint. Rads Morales really captures that moment perfectly. You see the elongated man stretching out as quickly as he can, but he knows he's too late.
Right.
It's too far gone.
Yeah, I mean, it unfolds really quickly, and it jumps into the main story and never skips a beat once it starts. And I really enjoyed that part of it. The pace of it was perfect. It never felt like it was dragging to me. I really enjoyed all the characters. Are there any characters that stood out to you more than others?
For sure. I think for me, the top 2 has to be our semi-narrator, and that being the Green Arrow. He really, almost in a Rorschach Watchmen-style way, told us a little bit about each character, including himself, and we got to not only see this particular story unfold through his eyes, but the neat part to me is we kind of, in a way, got to see this through everyone's eyes. We saw how it affected Superman, how it affected Batman when he showed up, how it affected Wonder Woman, The Flash, Green Lantern, all across the board. We got to see this from multiple different vantage points, and I think that's always neat when an author is able to incorporate different points of views. These are people that are all connected. They work together. It's no different than real life.
Right.
Whether you're in an office setting or out with friends, you all experience things differently, having that shared experience.
Right, and they did a good job of setting up the storyline and how it was going to go, the whole theme and feel of the story. During the stakeout, while they're talking, it comes out that Sue Dibny is planning Ralph's birthday, and it's something that she does every year, but she does it just at random points in the year because she thinks that that'll keep him from knowing about it, because they're surprise parties. And so all the Justice League members are already in communication because they're setting up a party and getting ready to have a party with everybody. They do a really good job of having each member connected and knowing exactly what's going on. Everybody knows knows as soon as everybody else what happened, and it just takes off from there. Once the crime happens, they are all involved and ready to investigate and figure out who committed the crime.
And I think that's a testament to the authorship by Brad Meltzer. This is somebody that's a couple times over New York Times #1 bestseller in a multitude of categories, and there's no reason to believe that he wouldn't have been able to do that in this miniseries, and he does it so well. He really sets up that whodunit caper. You're trying to figure out page to page, okay, is it one of the Justice League members? That would be a crazy twist, or which villain could it be from the DC gamut? So you get to see all of the assassins in this, and their head base, they're all talking, pits them against one another, and it opens up. It's really, for it to be a mini series, it's actually quite expansive in regards to the DC universe.
Yeah, and they portray Ralph, it kind of feels like he's in retirement almost, because one of his points, even towards the beginning, the reason he knows that she's setting up this surprise party is because he doesn't really go out on stakeouts anymore or anything like that. And so when his wife tells him to go out on a stakeout or go to work, he knows that something's up, and they have such a history with each other, and he knows his wife so well that he knows that she's planning his birthday party, whether it be close to his birthday or not.
Right. So, I think that's just a good character development again from Brad Meltzer, and that he knows Ralph is going to be this archetype husband of the I'll play along for my wife and make sure that everything works out and we're both happy, and of course she wants to do something special for him every year, so you get that relationship right off the bat, and then just as quickly it gets stripped away.
Right. So you said a couple of the characters that popped out to you. I will say that the Flash really kind of took center stage to me as well, just in his conversations with the Arrow and what's going on and how they're handling it. I really enjoyed his character, and it feels kind of like it's in the later years, because they mention the fact that it's Wally West, not Barry Allen anymore as the Flash. So you really get the feeling that it's, I don't want to say in their twilight years, but I mean it feels like it's just further in the future, and everybody's kind of doing their own thing, and there are new members.
That's probably why they didn't call it Midlife Crisis.
Right. So how did you feel about the artwork?
The artwork I thought was beautiful. We had talked about this before the show, and even while we were reading this mini-series, it kind of had that 90s vibe to it, which, product of the 90s myself, born in 89, just to show my age there, it just really felt reminiscent of like the McFarlane copy of Spider-Man Run or something like that. It just was so sharp, and everything, just the detail that they were able to fit into each panel. One of my favorites was a multi-panel series with the Atom, where it showed his power of literally going from a molecule, if you will, to a 12th, and so on and so forth, and bursting through that rope. They showed him going through that process, and then panel by panel you started to see a more defined rope, the layers, and then eventually you saw him inside of the rope and then growing again, and bursting through it to cut it, and then coming up to full size. So like watching that happen on 2 pages through all those panels was just gorgeous.
Oh yeah, I'm a really big fan of this art. Just like you said, it feels very 90s, and I grew up in the 90s. I was born in 85, so a couple years older, but that's always been my go-to art style. So I really enjoyed the artwork.
Yeah, and again, the artwork is just top-notch throughout in this miniseries. And one of the coolest moments, I think, with the artwork, even though it is a very somber and sad scene, is how much detail was put in Sue Dibney's funeral. The 2-pager there, you have essentially everybody in attendance. You've got all of the Justice League. There's that iconic panel where it first starts in on just the chest logos of each of the characters: Wonder Woman, the Flash, Superman, that S, the lightning bolt. It's just very neat, and you see all the citizens that came together. You realize right away that this was a important person in their lives, just the same as when you lose somebody in real life. So the sense of realism throughout this miniseries I thoroughly enjoyed, and you had friends and family there. You had all kinds of Justice League members, other obscure members such as Animal Man, Mr. Miracle.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it too, because like obviously Ralph Dibney had a difficult time and couldn't give his speech, but you could tell that several of the Justice League members could tell something was going on, to where they found him after the funeral to talk about what he was going to do, because they knew that something was coming and he had some idea of who perpetrated the act.
And then we get you talked about the artwork with Rads Morales. He was able to really capture that balance of being upset but also being fiery angry.
Right.
And he whips his head around, stretches it, and says, "Find me Dr. Light." And so then that takes us right into how is Dr. Light involved in this? Because of course most of the Justice League members, and even Green Arrow with his narration, says, there was this alien technology for all of their loved ones in their homes, to where it was super hard to crack into this place. Even people that phased in and out or teleported might have a tough time. They might not be able to be detected per se, so they were on their radar as far as, okay, what villains fit the bill for this murder? Let's go try and spread out, throw a scatter plot or a fishnet, if you will, in the city, and let's track these guys or girls down and figure this out. Let's figure out some culprits.
Right.
And of course, the first place that Ralph goes to is Dr. Light.
Right. Yeah, there's obviously some history there, and I know, speaking on what you were talking about, the security systems in all of their houses was designed with alien technology, so they felt like it was impenetrable, and the only people that they felt could penetrate it, if anybody could, it was some kind of teleporter or phaser. But yeah, unfortunately, the history with Dr. Light, and probably the most controversial part of this miniseries, is that apparently he raped Sue Dibney at some point in the past. So he already was on Ralph Dibney's radar before anybody else was.
Undoubtedly so, and that's one of those that, was a tough scene for everybody to come across, because although it is certainly rightfully so shown off panel, everyone reading it knows what's implied there. And of course, I think that Meltzer did about as good a job as you could with a tough scene like that, with such a heinous act that it was. He also made you realize right away that the Justice League members themselves, when they arrived on the scene, knew exactly what had happened, acted right away in the best way that they could, and that also led to them having to make a very tough moral decision.
Right.
And that being, of course, the mind wipe panel there from Zatanna. That's one of those where, if you think about it from a Justice League standpoint, you can obviously see why you would want to, quote, wipe a villain's mind. There's quite a few villains I'm sure they wished that they could mind wipe over the years.
Right.
But in that given moment, it's really almost a 50-50 split there from the artwork that we see, where a couple of them don't agree with it. A few others say, absolutely. You heard he said he was going to come after her again, target her again. Why we've got this capability with Zatanna, why don't we use it in this very limited situation?
Right. And honestly, my thoughts on it, and of course this is just a purely real thought versus a entertainment, fake subject thought, just that I would rather see him be done away with than wiping his mind, but, to each his own. And I kind of questioned at first why they wouldn't have wiped Sue Dibney's mind as well, just so that she didn't have to deal with remembering what happened to her. But to your point, when we discussed it earlier, you were saying that it might make things awkward or might put a struggle on hers and Ralph's relationship if he knows about it and remembers it and she doesn't. It might cause a weird situation between the two of them. So I kind of see where you're coming from on that point.
Right, and I think it'd be one of those situations where you wouldn't want to just mind wipe everybody involved per se.
Right.
And of course, if that happened, we wouldn't have the rest of these chapters or the rest of this miniseries. It would just stop cold.
True.
Right in the middle. But this takes us right into a portion of where at this point we speed up time. We flash back a little bit to that moment. Then we come back to them still being on the hunt for Dr. Light. And of course, Dr. Light, being mind wiped, is not really aware of the events that transpired, only that he knows the Justice League is after him. He's in a tight spot. Mm-hmm. That's where they bring in the assassins. And speaking of assassins, he, of course, who are you going to call?
Not the Ghostbusters.
Not Ghostbusters, but none other than Deathstroke. And I think that's a great transition page and moment in this miniseries, because they set it up at that perfect line. Like, I believe they say something along the lines of, when things get bad or things get rough, I'm the guy they call. And Deathstroke kicks down the door, and from there, it's just mayhem.
Oh, yeah, and I was really surprised by his character, honestly. I mean, I know he's a pretty formidable foe, but they really did him up in this storyline, and, I mean, he was one step ahead of each one of the Justice League members. He was a lot more of an awesome character than I really have ever seen him be.
It blew me away.
In a bad way, obviously.
Right. Not that we were necessarily cheering Deathstroke on as he cut and sliced our favorite heroes.
Yeah.
But on the same hand, you got to hand it to the guy, and I think an important point that shocked us both was Green Arrow was sort of giving a play-by-play while you watched everything go down, and he was telling you just how destructive Deathstroke could be and how powerful this guy was. This is somebody that's capable of using 90% of their brain. Of course, the average human uses about 10%, so that's to have that capacity while being awake. I mean, look out. And then
Right.
the strength 10 men.
Right.
Oh my gosh.
That was surprising as well because I didn't ever know that. I mean, I guess that's not necessarily a superpower, but I don't know anybody that has the strength of 10 men. So I would say that it is, but I was not aware that he had any kind of power. I thought he was just a very well trained assassin, but that was interesting to learn.
For sure, and it's just one of those cool scenes because you really, me personally, I wasn't expecting Deathstroke to be involved in this miniseries, and the fact that we get him is just kind of a nice little gift,
Right.
I think, in a way, for some people. And for those fans that, really like the villains, I'm sure that would be an enjoyable moment. So, not everybody can like heroes, to each their own. But yeah, and then from there, really, you start to think, okay, so you're pulling in Deathstroke, that's just to help out Dr. Light. And from there, it's like, all right, but we still don't know who's done it. And we come to find out later from all the investigative work that this is about the time that we see somebody like Mr. Miracle get involved and do all of his research. He's scanning the house. The atom gets brought into play.
Right.
He's literally going through all of the different carpet fibers, and Green Arrow wants to make sure that they're doing all their due diligence to see who did this.
Right.
And Batman was an important person that was not at the funeral. And in that big 2-page panel that we got for all of the funeral attendees, Batman was not one of them. And that's a point I wanted to bring up, Charlie, because the author himself, Brad Meltzer, brings it up in a great way. That's not really Batman's character. He's not a funeral guy. This is somebody that had to bury his own parent. To be true to his real character, he would be someone that's out there doing the detective work, trying to figure out who did this, get to the bottom of it.
Right.
Because Batman is supposed to be enigmatic and unpredictable by nature, and that's a direct quote from Brad Meltzer. So I think he really knew the right time to bring Batman into this particular miniseries. I think he shows up around, per Brad Meltzer, page 118, but he's kind of hinted at up until that point, and that's the whole mythos of Batman. It's like there's, he's out there.
Yeah, and I would say that he would definitely be, not that he doesn't think it's something that's not necessary or something that shouldn't happen, but I could definitely see Batman being the type that would say, funeral's a waste of time. We're wasting precious time in figuring out who did this, and he would want to spend his time doing the investigation and figuring it out as fast as he could versus being one that wallows and has to grieve. You know what I mean? I'm not trying to say he's heartless, but I mean...
No, not at all, but he's definitely more of a matter of fact, I'm sorry for your loss, but let's figure this out, and if we can, try and get some level of vengeance. And while he's in the process of doing that, this also introduces us to another significant character, and that being Tim Drake as Robin.
Right, and that was part of the story that really got to me because it was really intense in the panels where you see him at home talking to his father and wrestling with the decision to go help or stay out of harm's way. And of course his father, he wants him to be safe, but he also knows that this is who he is and that he needs to help figure out what happened and catch the person that did this. So ultimately his father tells him to go meet with the Justice League and figure it out.
And that's a tough scene because, and really the significant moment from that panel to panel has to be when Batman and Robin are in the Batmobile. They get the call, I believe it's Barbara, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think so.
And, she says, you gotta get back to your dad's house right now, to the Drake household. There's somebody there. Of course, that somebody being Boomerang, who's oddly different in this particular run.
He was portrayed as a very different character than I've seen him in the past, and that was part of going back to Tim Drake and his dad. As soon as his dad told him to go and Tim Drake left, you really get the picture that something's about to happen because there was really no other reason for them to be having that conversation. It just kind of felt out of place at first, but at the same time, it pushed the story forward, and you knew as soon as Robin left that something bad was going to happen. And so his father, after Robin leaves, his father receives a package that has a gun in it and a note that says, defend yourself. And that's when Batman and Robin get the call from Barbara saying, you need to get back to the house.
Right, and around that time, to tie right back into our discussion here, that's where Batman drops the line of, not again. Not again, of course, referencing very significant to the loss of the first Robin. Calvin, Dick Grayson's parents. It's something he's already been through, not on his watch. Of course, as you can see where we're going with this, unfortunately, it's one of those moments, like you said, Charlie, you know something's off, something is coming. You're just not quite sure what. And then when you see Boomerang and you see that back and forth panel of, Mr. Drake with the gun, it's like, well, one of the two is not going to make it, or potentially both.
Right.
And that's exactly what ends up happening, is bang bang, they both are gone. And of course, we get sort of a feel-good moment with Boomerang earlier. He finds out that he's got a son that he didn't know about, so they get a chance to have that in an odd sort of way with the Boomerang instead of a baseball father-son toss, if you will.
Right, and that's another thing about the story that was interesting to me. There seemed to be a real father-son theme in the story, just in different characters, because Tim Drake and his dad were part of it, and then even Tim Drake and Batman kind of have a father-son relationship as well, and then you have Boomerang and his father, as well as Green Arrow and his son. So it was weird, and I didn't get the picture that there was any reason really for that, but there was definitely a father-son theme going throughout the story.
And I think for me, my main takeaway was that just that reminder that these heroes are people too, and that while certainly some of them are super in certain aspects, they are still human, or they have that human quality.
Right.
Because there are definitely moments throughout where they mention the loss of family members or other friends or parents. So it's these particular heroes are impacted just like we are on a day-to-day basis. But of course, while all of this unfortunate happenings are going on at the Drake residence, all the while, they're not the only ones being affected by this. Of course, the Adams divorced ex-wife was, on the attack, or she was actually being attacked, I should say.
Right, and actually that does kind of go back to what I was saying about it not necessarily making sense, but it really does, because I guess the theme or the thought behind it was really more, well, this happened to Elongated Man's family member, so all of their family members kind of come into play, and everybody starts worrying about their significant others or children. And when you think about it, it actually does make a lot of sense. It just was off feeling because it was a father-son thing, but I guess that's just because most of them have a father, versus a wife or whatever.
And a character that was pulling the strings behind, or at least, someone that could have potentially been that whodunit guy, was the Calculator. That's somebody that had the in with all of the different villains, and this one was talking to everybody,
right.
Setting up the mystery package there at the very beginning, making sure that he had plenty of work for Boomerang and others throughout the miniseries. So it's one of those where we thought, okay, maybe this is that unknown mastermind that's pulling all these strings, and he'll end up being the bad guy. But they still were having to do all kinds of detective research, and they weren't really getting anywhere. They had people going out for reserves, going after all these different villains, and of course the main theme from Batman was, well, who benefits from this murder? Who just kept asking, who benefits?
Right, and actually thinking about it after having read the book, the villains were just as confused as the heroes were, and they were more or less trying to figure out who did it as well. So, I mean, looking back on it now, I see that there were parts where it seemed like the villains were just trying to figure it out as much as everybody else was.
Right, because in a sense, they were almost just going about business as usual, trying to make a buck or, do what they do best.
What villains do.
Which, that brings us to probably our favorite part of this discussion, something that neither of us really quite saw coming.
Right.
Because we're about at that point in the miniseries. We really see this ship trying to put all these pieces of the puzzle together. And there's even a panel where Batman specifically is shown doing that. We've got people doing autopsies on Sue Dibney's body, trying to look at everything, because when the Elongated Man first finds her, she's got severe burn damage, and we learn later in the miniseries that was more or less a cover to try and cover up what actually happened.
Right.
And that's by Rads Morales here, just to keep giving him praise. It's such a great panel scene where you get that little snapshot of Sue Dibney's brain, and there's those two little footprints.
Right.
And then, of course, in that panel with Batman, he says, I've reviewed all the puzzle pieces all the way down to the very molecule. And then at that moment, it clicks in your mind, and you're thinking, no way.
Right. And I mean, I knew that there was a twist coming just from people having told me about the series, but I did not expect who it was or what actually happened. In the autopsy, you see brain and you see two little footsteps, and they're all like, there's no way it couldn't be Adam. There's no way he would have done this. And so then you cut to Adam and his ex-wife while the heroes are realizing what they think is probably the worst possible fact about the murder. And then we jump to the Adam and his ex-wife having a conversation. And because of everything that's gone on with this murder and everybody worrying about their family members. They've kind of resolved their differences, and there's romance, and they're coming back together. So,
and there's definitely previous panels where they rekindled that a bit.
right.
And, it's a great transition to bring up because in that moment, they're having that conversation, just talking about all the events that have unfolded, about how Lois Lane got a letter stating that essentially the killer knew who Lois Lane was. All these significant others were getting all of these different notes and memoirs that were freaking everybody out. And she mentions one that sparks that moment in Adam where he's like, wait a minute, how do you know about this?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the note that was left for Mr. Drake that said, protect yourself with a gun.
Right.
That was a letter that Batman, being the great detective that he is, kept it for himself and out of the news. And so, of course, Adam knows this because direct connection to Bruce Wayne and Batman. And so he starts to question and says, no, wait a minute, that one wasn't reported. How do you know about this? And she tries to play it off and say, oh, well, they all were discussed in the news.
Right.
And, of course, he reiterates, no, I know for a fact. I was there. I watched Batman crumple that up. And then he, of course, gets very angry and very loud. And in all red says, how do you know? Tell me how you know. And it's at that moment that she spills the beans and just has to let him know, well, because they both realize it. She's the one that's been behind this the whole time. She actually found one of his older previous Adam suits and used it to, in her attempt, was to scare or partially harm Sue. She never intended to murder her at all.
It was an attempt to get him back in her life, and unfortunately he realizes that she's the one that did the crime. And then it kind of goes quickly to the end of the story from there.
It did end very abruptly, but I think they still did a good job going back and showing how she went about doing everything, actually essentially roping herself into danger, putting the rope over her neck, making it look like that she was in trouble.
Right.
And of course, she brought some tools with her just in case things went wrong, and was the one that ended up essentially torching the body to try and hide the murder as best that she could. And then from there, she had to make it look like she's not the only target. This was somebody that was targeting everybody, so that Adam would essentially come back to her. And of course, she says, but it worked, you came back. But I mean, at that point, you just see somebody, no pun intended, that is just distraught on a molecular level.
And so as soon as he realizes what happened, they have an argument, and she basically goes through and does the whole I did it for us, scenario and conversation. And then we jump to the next page, and it's the Adam leaving Arkham Asylum where he just turned her in. So the crime is solved, but it just kind of leaves everybody in shock.
Certainly the characters are all, taken back by this. And Adam really, in a way, just kind of removes himself from that world. He goes into some sort of microverse, if you will, as he goes all the way down to as far as he can shrink and just disappears, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, he basically checks out.
More or less, he really does, from both the miniseries and from that world.
Right.
All together. And all that leaves is for some of those loose ends to be tied up at the very end in, recapping, like, let's be honest, Wally West is still internally very bothered by the whole mind wipe. Had he been there, he doesn't believe he would have stood for it. He certainly doesn't believe it should have happened in the first place. The Green Arrow is trying to explain, look, kid, things were different back then. That age-old, older superhero that's like, you don't understand how things were. We were just doing things that we had to do. And we'd get another big reveal, and that's that Dr. Light wasn't the only mind swipe that night.
Right. And we find out that they also mind swipe Batman. And that one, to me, was the most surprising one. I did not see that coming.
I didn't either, and it was surprising, but the more that you thought about it, or after you closed the book, it's one that really made sense, especially the way that they explained it themselves in the series, because, let's be real here, Batman is one of those, and you see this in the panel work. He gets there, comes back to check on everything, to see what they're going to do with Dr. Light, and lo and behold, he sees Zatanna mind-wiping Dr. Light, and for Batman, that just goes against everything that he stands for, his moral code. That's just not something that he would have allowed. If he would have been there to have a vote in the matter, it would have went a lot differently. I don't feel like they would have actually really, let's be honest, when it comes to the Justice League, yes, it's somewhat of a democracy, but Superman and Batman pretty much always have the last say. And so they all knew, because they understood he wouldn't be okay with that, they had to go ahead in the same swoop and not completely mind wipe Batman, because obviously there are plenty of things you could probably reasonably take away that Batman would appreciate, and he'd probably have a better life, maybe not be Batman. But regardless, they knew they had to take away just enough so that it didn't dismantle the League, or they would have to then own up to the fact that how long have they been doing this? Is this the first villain they did this to? Is this the first Justice League member they've done this to? So in that particular instance, it was one of those where they knew they had to do it, but they also understood understood the causality of it and the consequences. And to me, reading it, I think that was my biggest takeaway, was that whether you're a hero or whether you're just a regular human, we all sometimes are faced with tough choices that we know we have to make, and sometimes doing the right thing isn't always the easiest, but we also have to understand the consequences that come from them.
Oh yeah, and it really felt like to me that finding that out was a turning point for Wally West. I mean, I don't think he is going to leave the Justice League or anything like that, but it definitely changed his opinion on the team, and he is really struggling with why they did that, or that they did it at all.
Right, and that's where, of course, Green Arrow just reverts back to, hey, it was different times.
Right.
We had to do what we had to do, and they eventually come to an understanding. But I still think it's safe to say that Wally West is probably going to steer clear of Zatanna for a little bit.
Yeah, I would say so.
This.
So that's the end of the story, and like I said before, my overall opinion on this was a very intense and different story than I think I've ever read involving superheroes. And right and wrong felt really blurred, and it was a good character study on superheroes and what they have to deal with on a daily basis.
I think that's a great way to describe it, because it really puts some of these characters under a microscope, and we were the ones in the lab, panel to panel, getting to adjust, zoom in, zoom out, and really just kind of see those layers of each character told beautifully from different vantage points throughout. So this one, from cover to cover, was just a very enjoyable read that we would recommend to everybody. And speaking of reading comic books, as we've come to a close here on Nerdy by Nature, I wanted to ask you, Charlie, so when you're reading any type of comic book or graphic novel, what have you, what are some of your ways that you like to read, and how do you go from panel to panel in your mind?
Well, when I first started reading comics, I would say it was a lot different than the way I read them now. When I first started reading them, I always liked more art than words, just because I wasn't the biggest fan of reading to begin with. Now, I'm a lot more into the reading aspect of it. I still pay attention to the art, but I think I get more immersed in the conversation aspects of it. And I do sometimes have voices in my head of the different characters, but it's mainly more of I read it in a narrative or narrator sense of reading. So what about you?
That made sense, and I think I do, I think logically we all do a little of our own version of narration whenever we're reading something. And for me personally, what I like to do is, of course, I like to do impersonations and accents and things like that, which I'm sure will come out later in the show at some point. So but for me, especially when I was reading some of the character bubbles, I would give them either a certain accent or a type of tone that I figured or thought that this character would speak in. For example, with Batman in particular, growing up, huge fan of the Batman animated series, and so that voice, the "Where is he? I'm Batman."
Right.
And so I just pictured that every time the Batman spoke, or if I'm reading, say, like The Killing Joke, I'll use kind of like a hybrid between Mark Hamill and Heath Ledger and throughout those panels.
Right.
So I think it's always fun to play around with some of those voices as you're reading certain graphic novels and comics.
Right, yeah, and I would say that Heath Ledger probably is the main one that pops into my head when reading the Joker. Like, I know the animated series and everything, but I was never really big into it. I didn't watch it a whole lot, just because I've never been that big a fan of animation. I am a lot more now. Heath Ledger definitely pops into my head every time I read anything by the Joker.
And one thing I also wanted to bring up, just to end on a light note, because this is a heavy miniseries at the end of the day, let's be real. There were some comedic relief moments throughout this one, and I think one of my favorite is the very beginning, where it's that just typical back and forth, lighthearted conversation, sitting there in the kitchen, and of course they're arguing over a typical mom and son argument of, "Oh, Mom, you don't have to pay for the Daily Planet. I work there. I'd be happy to give you these subscriptions for free."
Yeah.
And of course she uses the line, "Well, I can pay for my own, thank you very much. I bet the Batman doesn't do this to his parents." And then you see that kind of lip bite, scene there by Superman, because we all know why he's doing that. But it's just that obliviousness of that you're just like, it's kind of a dark humor, but still some comedic relief throughout there if you look for it.
Right, and this series, like you said, it definitely needs comedic relief.
And we almost forgot to go over our favorite quote from this miniseries, and that one came from, of course, Bruce Wayne Batman himself on that really neat full layout transition page, and it's one that says, "I chose this life, I know what I'm doing, and on any given day, I can stop doing it. Today, however, isn't that day, and tomorrow won't be either." That's powerful.
Absolutely. Yeah, I liked it so much that I took a picture of it and posted it on my social media pages.
It makes for a nice background.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed the book, honestly. It was different than most storylines you get in comics these days. It was a lot more serious, and there were a lot more heavy moments in it, but I would say it overall is a great story, and I would recommend it to anybody that hasn't read it.
Likewise, it's an easy read, something that you can pick up on a lazy afternoon or while you're doing laundry. For any occasion, really, you can just get through it and even take your time. Go panel by panel like we did and take it all in. It's a lot in the sense of the depth of the subject. It's
Right.
Obviously a mini-series, but it has a huge impact, no doubt. And with that, Charlie, I think we have to, in true nerdy by nature fashion, we of course gave a nerd ranking to Spider-Man Far From Home, the movie. We're going to do the same thing with these comic book runs that we do, or graphic novel reviews. How many nerds, so if you keep in mind, for those of you that forgot, it's been a few episodes, our nerd scale is from 1 to 5, kind of like a 5-star rating, the only difference being nerds. We still haven't quite figured out what a half a nerd is. We'll get back to you on that. We're still doing some research and development. We're new, but if you had to give this one so many nerds out of 5 being the max, just, classic, where would Identity Crisis fall on our nerdy by nature scale?
Honestly, I would probably give it 4 out of 5. I really enjoyed it. I was never bored with it. I felt like the pace was great, and I loved the art. And the only thing I would say that I didn't care for, if you can even say that, is just how heavy it was, the subject matter. But, I mean, that made for a very interesting and good story.
I would have to agree to that. The only for me is it's hard for me to give it that whole 4 nerds, because to me, when you talk about 4 nerds, or if you want to compare it to 4 stars, you get into that 4-star, 4.5, 5 range. I feel like you're more on that iconic cusp of just a must-read, have to have in your collection, which this one we would recommend anybody, of course, go out and purchase it. You can find it in shops ranging anywhere from $10 to $12 in trade paperback, or maybe even 20 or a little bit more in the hardcover. And it's got a lot of great moments, a lot of iconic characters, and it's a solid read from cover to cover. I just don't know if it's one of those that I would have to run out and buy tomorrow. Like, it's one that if you eventually want to read it, sure, go for it. So that's why for me, I'm going to give it the 3.5 nerds, but I don't disagree with your 4 nerds. It's still a very well done, well written, beautifully drawn piece.
Yeah, definitely. And that's fine. Things hit different people different ways, so...
Different strokes for different folks.
Absolutely.
For sure. And that's really going to wrap things up here for us on Nerdy by Nature, but feel free to check in next episode, and we're always happy to have you guys here. We enjoy everybody that's listening so far. Feel free to comment, make sure to hit that like button, and by all means share this to everyone that you think would enjoy it, and even some people that maybe haven't gotten into this realm yet. You want to introduce them into this realm. And so this is Agent Smith signing off.
And this is Captain Rogers signing off. Thank you for listening, and God bless.